Anything that the devil wants from you is for you to remain in the dark. That's why he likes people who are fully isolated. That's why he likes people who are silent. That's why he likes people who don't want to talk about the truth or bring any of those things to light. He loves thriving in secret sin versus sin that's more outward and out there for others to see, right? God is a God who sees all. So whether you come to him or not, he sees. And he's just waiting for you to come so that he can redeem you and to restore you. Hey fam, welcome to What I'm Learning in My 30s, honest lessons that God has been teaching me currently while I heal, grow, and walk through this thing called life with him. If you're new here, I'm Shanika. If you are recurring, welcome back, welcome back. Okay, so today I'll actually be sharing my personal testimony of how God has walked me through some really low, difficult places, and just as a way to kind of let you know that you're one, not alone, and that you're also two, not too far gone, that God can't use you. And so today's episode is actually going to be entitled My Testimony, You're Not Too Broken for God. One of the reasons why I am making this episode, like I said, besides the initial point, is just out of obedience to sharing my, like I said, my journey. I think that a lot of the times, especially if you're in some sort of, leadership role, or you have a platform as a Christian content creator, or just any platform per se, a lot of the times people just see kind of like almost, if you want to say, finished work, or just more of the perfected work versus the actual journey that it took to get here. And then obviously the journey that you'll continue to see, right? And so I wanted to, like I said, share this testimony to just peel that back and just show the many ways that God has shown up, but not only showed up, but also healed and redeemed parts of my life and is continuing to do so. And so the first thought that I had just in general, just throughout my walk with Christ prior to now, has just been like, I didn't know that God could reach me at the place that I was at. I thought, growing up in church and just seeing, super religious people around me, I thought that there was a level of perfection that was required, or there was a level of, sinlessness that was required, or just a level of elitism, in a sense, spiritual elitism that was required for God to not only reach me, but actually be with me, actually walk with me, actually use me. And so I didn't know for a long time that I wasn't too broken for God to actually show up, for God to actually, commune with me, for God to actually use me. And so I'm pretty sure for many of you watching, this might be something that you probably feel right now or have felt in your journey, because again, we just kind of have this thing of, we wear the shame and the guilt of either what we've done or what was done to us. And so a lot of the times there's that worthlessness that comes in, or there's that, jaded view of ourselves or of God, not realizing that he's actually gracious, that he's actually merciful, that he's actually loving. And so we oftentimes think that we are too far gone to be, again, used, or even to be, accepted by God. But before I begin just going into my testimony and everything, I want to do like a gentle trigger warning for those who have gone through maybe abuse or other things, traumatic instances or events in their life, that this might be heavy a little bit. But most of this episode is about just showing how the things that I've gone through has really shaped my view, and how God, again, has healed and redeemed me throughout. And so I'm not going to be leaning heavily on graphic details or just super details, because the point of it is not to trauma dump or to just really, again, hone in on just the trauma. I wanted to hone in more on the thought process that the trauma created, and just how God has been walking me through that from that point on until now. So let's get to the before. understanding like how trauma can show up just in general for most of us in our inner world, which is our thoughts, our souls, our hearts. It can show up in so many different ways. So you have like fear, you have shame, you have hyper independence, you have depression, you have survival mode, which are all the things that my inner world has been shaped by. And these patterns, and there's so many more, right? And these patterns don't often just show up in one area. So it's not just relationships, it's not just career or ourself or, our faith, but it also can show up in finances and just so many different things. And so I want this episode to really get to the root of a lot of things, because sometimes we think that a problem could be like, for instance, finances, right? For me personally, I grew up in poverty, and I grew up from, a family that wasn't necessarily, wealthy, right? And so you would think that, okay, if you're going through financial struggles, then yes, the probability of you kind of like, carrying on that generational thing is great, but not understanding the root as to why, besides just the fact that you grew up in poverty or, the generation before you grew up in poverty, I think is some of our biggest mistakes, because sometimes we don't realize how much it could be attached more to trauma and spiritual matters versus just the probability of the physical thing of like, oh, I just grew up in poverty. And so for me personally, finances were always a struggle, not because I didn't make enough. And most times it was the case of not making enough, right? But sometimes it was the case of just how I handled my finances, how I stewarded my finances. I didn't always steward my finances well. I definitely leaned into, like I mentioned in like episode 1, where I realized my lack came from a lot of the times covetousness. So I oftentimes wanted more or, desired more because I might have saw someone else experience a thing or buy a thing or, have something. And I thought that like that thing that they had, or even just a thing that it wasn't based on the influence of anybody else. It could just be me seeing something and just feeling like I want it and being impulsive and getting things versus thinking things through or being prudent. I realized that, a lot of the times I was trying to fill a void, right? Like a lot of the times I didn't realize that it was, again, the times when I was depressed. It was like you thought that these things could soothe you, just like people can, find comfort in so many different things like gluttony through food or through relationships or through so many other things. For me, it was buying stuff. And so I felt like, one, if I bought a lot of stuff, it was filling this void. It was kind of giving me value, giving me self-worth. But then on the other hand, it was more so like, it kind of erased for that moment the feeling of lack. And so the lack wasn't just financially, because sometimes we buy things because we're like, oh, I don't want the evidence of like I'm in poverty or I'm reflecting like previous generations. Sometimes it could be lack just within, like I didn't get enough love or enough attention or, enough nurture or enough guidance. And so you're trying to fill this just lack, this void, this lack. And so I think that's the case that I figured with myself and found the root to that. And so it hasn't been until the most recent years, especially like the past 2 years or so, or the past year especially, that God has really handled the root of that. And so in order for me to break this generational cycle of poverty and lack financially, I had to get to the root of why, even though I made money or even though I made large sums of money in certain periods, I found myself still going in lack. And so I realized that instead of depending on God, I was still using, again, buying things or just impulsively spending as a way of filling this void that I just felt internally that I couldn't, again, put a voice to, right? Or to describe. And so that's just an example of just kind of like how traumas can show up in so many different ways, not just emotionally in emotion, but also in our actions and what we do and, how we treat people and relationships and just, again, self-worth and even our faith in God. And so a lot of times, like I said, it made me believe, a lot of the traumas made me believe that like I had to be self-reliant. I had to be hyper independent. I had to be, walking around in fear, right? Social anxiety, or just fear of, not being in control, being outside or being far away from home, or just certain little things. I realized that all of these things were just like my way of trying to remain in control versus being able to release control and understanding that not having control is not a bad thing. It's actually a freeing thing. And so again, we're going to delve into like how God has been kind of like, redeeming and healing those things. But that's just the belief systems that a lot of the trauma that I have gone through has, shaped. And so I want to kind of break down some of the traumas. I'm not going to go through like every single trauma, but some of the major big traumas that I feel like definitely shaped a lot of my thought process over the years. And so, I've spoken, if you follow my podcast, Scratch Everything, I've spoken briefly about like, past traumas, the age ranges, and just all of the things as it relates to that. But again, for the purposes of this video, I'm not going to really go into all of that stuff in terms of like what age I was and all of this stuff. But most of the bulk of the trauma has happened in childhood. So if you want to go from a range of like, maybe young, I want to say maybe from like 7 and into my late teens, that's kind of like the period where a lot of the bulk of, the traumas that I faced happen. And so the first trauma was verbal and emotional abuse. So my father was an alcoholic. I grew up with a single mom. And so she was, for the first half of my childhood life, up until about 8, I grew up without my dad, didn't know my dad. And so when you think about like growing up with a single mom, as much as she tried her best, and looking back now, she did her best to do what she could, not having guidance from her own mother to be able to understand like how to take care of me. But also just, trying to balance work, and also trying to, be present in the home and all of these things. You go through a bit of identity, right? Identity crisis, right? When you don't know the other half of yourself, because really and truly a mother and a father makes up your entire identity, right? Or that's how we come into the world thinking. And so for me, for the first half of my childhood, I didn't know my dad. So for me, that's already identity issues, right? And so when I did meet him at like around 9 or so, they shortly after got married, and then we became a 1-unit family. So my dad was in Jamaica, he came here, and we became a 1-unit family. Now, after a while, he kind of fell into alcoholism, and that environment was kind of marked by a lot of instability, harsh words, emotional unpredictability, manipulation, and just a lot of gaslighting and things like that. And for me, over time, it produced like low self-esteem, anxiety and depression, gaslighting effects, and just so many different things. And it kind of made me really double-minded when it came to not just myself, but also just relationships and just being actionable in terms of, pursuing things, or, being responsible, things like that. And so it constantly made me kind of question myself and my worth. And I learned to kind of shrink and overthink early on. And I think that played out a role even after like, the trauma. It played out definitely into my young adulthood, and, going through career changes and job changes and instability there, and just instability in relationships, and just all around, right? And so it was just like you didn't feel secure in anything. And that was one of the things that like really laid the foundation, right? And so again, you start off with like having a 1-parent household, which is already unstable. And then you go into a 2-parent household, but then there's more instability that's like tacked on, and in new ways and in more, traumatic ways. And so I felt like throughout like my entire life, and especially after the trauma, like I'm just not safe in certain areas. I'm just not safe in certain things. And so I also felt the whole thing of like, I'm not enough. So a lot of the times that played out in, not really putting my efforts in school, like, going to college and pursuing psychology, which was a passion. I wanted to actually go into child psychology and be a school counselor, and not finishing, actually flunking out eventually, and only being like 1 year away from graduating. And so that level of instability, because like throughout the years, I struggled to go to classes, couldn't concentrate. And again, at that time, I was dealing with immense depression. And depression and anxiety. So a lot of the times it was hard for me to go to school. Sometimes I just didn't have the motivation or the feeling to do so. And so a lot of that just, again, produced a lot of instability in my life, and just in just how I viewed myself and how I viewed the things I pursued. And so, like I said, eventually I ended up flunking out. And by the grace of God, he gave me the opportunity after flunking out, like about a year or so later, to be able to be reinstated. There was like this way that you can kind of like reapply and be reinstated, and you'd be kind of like in a probationary short period. And I was able, by his grace, to be able to do that and get that opportunity. But again, wasn't healed. And so you go back and you just repeat the same cycle and just flunk out again. And at that point, I just kind of like, put it behind and didn't even have the motivation to just retry. And so that was kind of like one of the things that definitely shaped how I just viewed myself. And again, dealing with the crippling anxiety and depression was something that also made it even more difficult. And then you have like the lack of affection from my mom. I've spoken about this briefly in like either mentioned it in a few episodes of my podcast or whatever. And although my mom wasn't abusive, one would call it emotional violence. And so this is kind of like when people withhold, right? And so there's like a lack of affection. There's criticism that's constant. Codependency, where she was codependent on me. And just emotional unavailability that kind of deeply shaped me again, right? So then you have the first set of trauma, which is verbal and emotional abuse, but then you have this second set, which is like a lack of, emotional availability from the woman, right? So this is, again, the mother, the nurturer. If you know anything about attachment styles and all of those things, we understand. If you know psychology, it's like something that's talked about a lot, where it's super important to how a child comes into the world and how well they're able to attach with their parent. There's 4 types of styles. And so depending on the style that is, nurtured and is made well, that child will then kind of like create their personality, and that will then shape how they attach to other people and things and the world in and of itself. And so not having that definitely taught me not to expect softness or nurturing from other people. To only be there for people without expecting reciprocity. And just in general, I just learned to be self-reliant instead of emotionally connected. And I realized that played out in, relationships, whether it's romantic relationships, whether that's platonic relationships, especially as it relates to women. Having either female friends or, maybe a mentor or maybe, a mother figure. Just not getting emotionally attached or connected, because I just never had that from the core. And so a lot of that has shaped, again, it goes right back to shaping it to God, right? And so God is a mother and a father to us. And so it's the same kind of reflection that I learned growing up. In a sense, it's like I felt like me and God were distant. So he's there and I pray and I read my word ever so often, but I never felt that connection. I never felt like I was actually adopted by him, that I was actually his child. I felt like I needed to prove it, or that, that he was depending on me to do certain works to get that love, or that again, like he wasn't soft or nurturing, that he was just this iron fist God that was just waiting to judge. And that's the only time that he came present, when he wanted to discipline or judge. And so these are all things that, again, shaped my view. And so needing people felt very unsafe. And I just felt like I kind of had to handle everything myself. And so this is, again, where it created that major reliance, self-reliance. And that's one thing that God has been definitely working on me with the past year, especially with not being self-reliant, learning to be dependent on him. And it's been a very hard, painful journey and walk. But as I have now been coming out on the other side, I've realized just how much safety there is in actually depending on him. And at first, initially, that fear comes in where it's like, I don't know, like, first off, I'm depending on an invisible God, right? So it's like, you know, the enemy and your mind will tell you, like, if you couldn't depend on physical people that was here that you can touch, how in the world are you going to depend on a God you haven't seen, right? Like, you read about him in his word, but you haven't seen him. Like, you have, you know, the children of Israel and other people in the Bible who have seen physical manifestations of God, or certain, signs and miracles and wonders that proved that God was here. And while there is things that prove that God is here every day, right? There's things in nature and just so many different things. In our day to day, he can feel kind of invisible, right? And it just be like, we're literally having like blind faith on a God we can't see. But as I've learned to foster intimacy, I've learned that he actually is very present, and he does show you that he's present, and he does speak, and he does guide, and he does comfort. And so those are things that I've had to learn from, again, this basis of like lack of affection from my mother, right? And so, like I said, it just created just hyper independence for me, emotional walls, and difficulty receiving love from both people and God. And so I just want to, again, say that, like, I was just missing, like I said, safe attachment. I was missing a sense of identity as a girl / woman to be. I was, I was kind of missing the understanding of how to regulate my emotions when I feel any kind of emotions, and just knowing how to be affectionate in general. And so these were just things that I've just, learned that were voids that, again, like showed up in so many ways, from finances to, just how I was emotionally or in my thought process, to relationships, to God, to all of the things. And so the third thing that I want to go on is the distrust of relationships. And like I said, especially with women. And the interesting thing is that my distrust is kind of different with men and women. And so, like I said, because safety and consistency weren't modeled early on, I struggled deeply with trust, especially in relationships with both men and women, although it showed up slightly differently. And so I learned to, again, stay guarded, keep my emotional distance, and just protect myself from disappointment or betrayal. And that is just kind of like what I've learned to do. That was the survival mode. That was the things that we don't realize how much when you've gone through enough trauma, you kind of start learning coping mechanisms. And so that was my coping mechanism, just, again, building up this wall and keeping myself safe. And so connection to me equaled risk. And so I just didn't want to be close because I wanted control of my emotion. I wanted control of the outcome. I wanted control of the painlessness that I wanted to feel versus, the risk of being in pain, or the risk of being hurt, or the risk of being betrayed. And so another thing was the difficulty in submitting in my marriage and to God. So this is something that I noticed early on, or I would say, as I said, the past 2 years or a year especially, as I've gotten even deeper in my relationship with God. Like, that's one of the things that God has been showing me. And I've known this for some time. And so although me and my husband, we were high school sweethearts and we started off there, and we've been together through a lot of ups and downs and just evolutions and evolvings with each other. it definitely was something that I knew was a struggle. And it's not so much so like, it was like volatile or anything like that, but it was just like, I just had a hard time, again, not being self reliant, not being the one in control, not being the one that led versus being led. And so I just had that hard time with submitting. And like I said, those same survival patterns were showing up, like even in my marriage. And so I felt threatening because, again, control just was the thing that equaled safety to me. And so trusting somebody else required that I had to unlearn all of that self-reliance. I had to trust that, he was being led by God. I had to trust that he knew what he was doing. I had to trust that he, had the wisdom. I had to trust that, that again, like that he would actually uphold his end of the bargain in terms of like being devoted to our marriage, loving me the way that I should be loved, taking care of me in a way that I should be taken care of. And so that was kind of the things that I've definitely had to really, really, unlearn, especially, growing up. And again, like my parents were married after, like I said, after I met my dad at 9, but I didn't see a modeled marriage that was godly. I didn't see a modeled marriage that had respect and had, the love and the affection and the submission, right? My dad was more so uneducated. And so although he had his own business and he thrived in having his own business and whatnot, my mom was the educated one. She was, professional in like a great field. And so, she had levels of education, like post grad and all of these things. And so I saw this like I guess what you call the epitome of a strong woman, right? Or someone that's more like, I'm independent, although I'm married. This is like a partnership, but not entirely. Like I can still fend for myself if you left or if you, weren't here kind of thing. And so I didn't see submission in that way. And when early on I did see it, it wasn't full submission in terms of heart, mind, and soul. It was more so like, I, cook for you. I make sure the house is clean. I share out your dinner. I do those things. But the heart wasn't submitted. The words weren't submitted. The way that you treat each other wasn't submitted. The way that you spoke to each other wasn't submitted. And again, just like your decision making wasn't submitted. Everything was like independent, but at the same time, we're saying we're partners. And so not seeing that modeled as well was a big thing for me. And then outside of that, like I've had other family members that were married, but it was kind of like reflecting the same thing. And then you had other family members that weren't married or were divorced. And so you saw a lot of brokenness, whether it was marriage included or not. And so for me, that shaped a lot of how I came into my own marriage. And so I've had to learn to really understand that, like, one, I'm not in control. Not just because I'm the woman and he's the man, but just in general, I'm not in control. Number two, now we get into the biblical context of things and understanding that, like, the husband is supposed to be the head, and this is what God has called it in that order for. And so when you honor God's order, he honors your marriage. And that's the thing that I've learned. And so I've also had to unlearn what does unhealthy submission look like versus actual healthy submission. And so when I learned and started, again, reading my word and understanding like how God really, puts together and integrates the word, it's like a lot of the times there's accountability on both sides, right? And so even when it comes to parent and child, like with the honoring thy mother and thy father, like I spoke about in my previous episode about, going no contact. There's a responsibility for the parent and also for the child, right? So it's the same with marriage. Like there's a responsibility that the woman should submit to the husband, but there's also the responsibility that the husband is supposed to love the woman like Christ loves the church. And so when I learned to understand God's nature and his character and the fact that he's just, I realized that there is safety in doing it in his way and doing it in his order. So even though like I'm supposed to let my husband lead, I'm supposed to let him lead, one, because he's being led by God, but two, because that allows me to be safe in the areas that God has, orchestrated it for me to be safe. And so, so that, like I said, really played a role into my marriage, but also into God, right? Like submitting to God, like understanding that like I knew that he was that he is God and he is sovereign and that he, commands and that he is the one that is above all. But I didn't allow my heart to be fully submitted. So if he said to do something, or he said to let go of something, or he said not to do something, it wasn't that I wasn't going to not obey, but I also kind of like delayed it sometimes. Or sometimes I was like trying to, negotiate with God. Like, well, God, I don't see this. I don't understand this. So why not just do it my way? And that really reflected how much I wasn't submitted to God, because ultimately when we're submitted to God, there's no questions asked. We just trust him. So we just do what he says, right? And so I think that just showed me the power struggle I had with that authority as well. And so again, that all just stemmed from, again, traumas, right? And so seeing it and experiencing traumas and all of those things really shaped my view in this area of submission. And so, like I said, if I didn't feel like I was in control, I feel like it would be something that would hurt me again. And so I needed to have control. I needed to be self-reliant. I needed to be independent. And so I want you to understand that submission is not weakness, and submission requires safety, not force. And so even with God, especially, like, God doesn't want us to submit out of fear and out of force. He wants us to actually submit out of feeling safe. Again, when you know his character and you know his nature, then you feel safe enough to submit, because you know that he's just, that he's loving, right? That he's merciful, that he's gracious. And so that's what it was in terms of the submission. And then you have where I go even more deeper. So I've spoken about this, I think, also in like one of my earlier episodes of my Scratch Everything podcast, about being molested as a child and how that distorted my self-worth. And so for a long time, I didn't speak about it. And for a long time, I actually didn't even share it with my husband until more recently, like the last 2 years or so. And so that was one of the things, I think that was one of the biggest things, because I think that was one of the first moments where the enemy was trying to really just mute my voice and mute my ability to, one, express, but also to bring things to light that were supposed to be brought to light. Because I think what we don't understand with trauma is the enemy cultivates trauma in such a way that it's supposed to produce a level of shame and guilt. He also makes sure that it produces silence. And a lot of the times, because we keep things in the dark, that's where he thrives. And so because we have that guilt and we have that shame, we don't oftentimes want to talk about the traumas that we've gone through, or the things that has happened to us, or the things that we've even done in sin, right? And so that is his MO, to make us silent so that we don't talk about it, so that we don't bring it to light, because darkness is where he thrives. Darkness is where he's able to continue to whisper. Darkness is where he's able to continue to control the narrative of what the truth appears to be, right? But it's not until we bring those things to light, we bring those things to God, who is light, that we're able to, one, see the truth for sure, but also, two, to be able to break free from that guilt and that shame, and to understand that, like, you were a victim. And so there's no blame, no matter what the scenario might have been, no matter what your response might have been, no matter what, how many times it's happened or didn't happen. I want us to understand that, like, if you're a victim, there's no blame to yourself. And so now the whole point of being a victim is now to become a victor, right? And so we only remain that victim, like I said, when we just keep it within the dark and we don't bring it to light. And so I've spoken about it, like I said before, in my earlier years of childhood. I experienced sexual trauma early in life that distorted my self-worth and safety, and it left me believing that my body existed to be used rather than cherished, and that love was conditional, right? And so this not only seeped over into platonic and romantic relationships, like I said, but also with God, and how I fell into a works-based faith and salvation mode. And so this was, again, by someone that I knew. And so the breaking of the trust is also gets distorted, as well as your self-worth. And again, as well as you feeling that like you're only here to be used. And so I was only valuable for what I could give, not for who I was. And the crazy thing is that because life can also replay that in your head, if you believe it long enough, you will start seeing things like that. So you might go through other experiences that kind of shape and continue to shape that narrative of like, it's hard for you to make friends, or people don't necessarily care about you in the way deeply as you do, or that people don't accept you, or family members, they overlook you, or, they neglect you, or they're, again, not emotionally available. So all of these things are further just adding to this narrative that you've already shaped based on this trauma. And so a lot of the times we just continue to believe it. And half of the time that's what keeps us silent, or that's what keeps us from sharing the truth or bringing it to life, or just again, bringing it to God, because we have been shaped by other experiences that seem to kind of correlate, right, with that. And so we think of it like cause and effect, like, oh, this is an effect that's happening everywhere, not realizing that sometimes it could just be a correlation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's because of the narrative you're thinking. It could be so many other different factors. And so if we're not careful, we, again, aren't able to see what the actual truth is. We just believe the lie that appears to be true. And so, like I said, I definitely wanted to, I definitely wanted for a long time to like believe that these things disqualified me from being used by God or just being in a relationship with him. And so, like I said, a lot of the times I think it shaped me into being more lukewarm. It shaped me into being more distant with God. It shaped me into, like I said, the work-based faith and salvation. But I just kind of learned that like the trauma explains your behavior, but it doesn't define your identity. And that only was through actually reading the word. That was actually through real prayer. That was actually through really just like really getting to know the Lord. And so for anybody that, like I said, if you've gone through any of the things I have, or even greater things or deeper things or more shameful things, whether it was that it happened to you or that you did it, right? I just want you to know that, again, it doesn't shape and define your identity. It is only behaviors. It is only what you've done. And the thing about God is that he's a loving father, and he hates the sin that we do, but he doesn't hate us. And so no matter how much you've sinned, or no matter how much you feel like all the sin has been thrown on you because you've been a victim to things, I just want you to know that, again, God doesn't hate you. He just hates the sin that we are in, or the sin that we do. And so the best thing that you can do is submit to him and to go to him and to run to him as you are. Because that's the thing. When we looked at Jesus, we saw Jesus do ministry. And for the 3 years that he did ministry and he did healings and all kinds of things, the people came as they were, and he didn't have a prerequisite. He didn't say, well, you have to come and you have to be in prayer, or you got to be sinless, or you got to be this, or you got to be that. No, what he actually did was he felt compassion for those who came to him seeking healing or deliverance from demons or whatever it was. He came to them in compassion. He saw the root of their need, right? Because he's all knowing. And he healed them, or he delivered them, or he casted out the demons, or he did whatever he did. And then he just said, sin no more. So the compassion level that Jesus had is the same way that God, the Father, has. Like he's not looking and saying, clean up yourself first and then come to me. He's like, no, come to me. Come to me so that I can restore you. And when you are restored, I ask you to keep yourself restored by abiding in me. And so there's no amount of things that you can do or things that has happened to you that can keep you away from going to God. God is waiting for you to come just as you are, whether you're addicted to anything, whether you've done sexual sin, whether you're living in sexual immorality, whether you're fornicating and living in that, or whether you're a thief or you're whatever. It doesn't even matter. Like, the whole point is that he wants you to come to him so that he can redeem you. And so don't wait until you're trying to fix yourself or trying to be better, because that's just the guilt and the shame that the enemy is using as condemnation to keep you, again, in the dark. Anything that the devil wants from you is for you to remain in the dark. That's why he likes people who are fully isolated. That's why he likes people who are silent. That's why he likes people who, don't want to talk about the truth or bring any of those things to light. That is why he loves thriving in secret sin versus sin that's more outward and out there for others to see, right? So it's just so important to understand that you cannot allow the enemy to condemn you to such a degree that you feel that you can't come to God. God is a God who sees all. So whether you come to him or not, he sees. And he's just waiting for you to come so that he can redeem you and to restore you. And we see this so many times throughout scripture. We see this even with the woman at the well. When he knew that she had how many husbands and that she was an adulterer, he didn't even shame her for that. He actually just mentioned all of the husbands that you have, that thirst that you're seeking, I can feel that thirst. And that is how God is coming to you, saying that regardless of all the things that you're doing, because you're trying to fill that void, or you're trying to, have that spiritual connection, or you're trying to have that human connection, understand that what you're seeking, only the Lord can provide. That peace that you're looking for, only the Lord can provide. And so it's the same exact thing. And I just want to remind anyone that's watching of that, because that is exactly how he met me. And like I said, I've been going to church for a very long time. And it was not until during the pandemic where, you had to be more at home, and the years leading after that I've learned to really commune and have intimacy with God. So I was doing church, I was tithing, I was doing the usual, listening to worship music too, reading my Bible ever so often, all of those things. But it was not until I fully consecrated myself and literally went to the Lord wholeheartedly, in all full honesty, broken, full emotions, no perfection, no trying to sugarcoat anything, literally being honest and just going to him and sharing with him my thoughts, the things that have hurt me, my past, all of those things. That's where I learned to actually meet God. And that's where I've learned that's where the redemption and all the things really started. And so there is a turning point for anybody that's going through any kind of trauma or any kind of, just cycle of just negativity or just hurt or pain. And so, like I said, it is definitely something that has definitely changed me eternally, but also internally. And like I said, it is also a process, because I also want that to be known, because sometimes we think that everything is just a one and done thing, a one instant moment. And just like Jesus, when he healed certain people, there were instances. But sometimes especially when it comes to trauma and just the hard work that we have to do, sometimes there's some things that he heals instantly because he knows that's going to be the thing that is a stumbling block to our walk. But most of the times it's a process, and that process is there because he wants us constantly dependent on him, right? And so understand that there's a process, there's a sanctification that's going to happen. Everything is not going to fall off. Every memory is not going to go away. Every pain is not going to be healed. But there is a from glory to glory to glory that you do see and feel through the help of the Holy Spirit and through God, that he actually is transforming you. He is actually renewing your mind. And these things come with us also, again, being dependent on him through prayer, especially, right? Not praying for him to change people or change things, but to change us, right? To change how we view things, so that whether people and things change, we're not changed. We're not wavered. We're anchored in him, right? And so that's the prayer. That's reading his word. That's one of the other things that's so important. Reading his word so that we, one, can understand who God truly is, his character, his nature, his ways, but also that it renews our mind on our circumstances. Okay, we're going to go through tests and trials. We're going to go through pruning seasons, but understanding what happens with that. Does God rescue me? Yes, he's never going to leave me. He said he's never going to forsake me. He said nothing's going to rip me from his hands, right? So all of these things help us as well, especially if you have gone through trauma. And like me, you've gone through areas and things where it's felt unsafe, learning that he's a safety net. that regardless of whether there's winds and waves, he promises that you're safe. He promises that he'll keep you grounded. And so that is like the greatest place, like I said, to start, where you meet God and God meets you. And so that is what he has definitely taught me in the past, especially 2 years. And so, like I said, God didn't rush me. He didn't shame me. He stayed. And it didn't feel holy. It felt exhausting, actually. Like I said, it's a lot of painful things. Sometimes he uses circumstances to bring to the surface things in your heart that you didn't know were there. Things that he wants to uproot, right? Because God wants us to be holy as he's holy. He wants us to be pure like him. But the thing about it is that he's a God that is so gracious that he gives us help. So he's not just asking us to be holy on our own. We can't do that. We're flesh. Like, flesh is contending against the spirit every day. So he doesn't expect us to do this on our own. That's why he gives us the Holy Spirit. That's why he gives us aid and he gives us help and he gives us strength and wisdom and guidance so that we can be like him, right? But he's showing us, he's giving us the help to be like him. And so I don't want you to ever feel overwhelmed, whether you are a believer, a new believer, or you're not and you're considering, or God is pulling you. I want you to understand that, like, don't look at Christianity and just this thing that we've made it in the church. I want you to look at the word. I want you to learn to have intimacy with God. I want you to learn to read the word. I want you to learn to pray to him. And I want you to learn to understand that he helps us to be more like Christ. He helps us to be more like him. He helps us to live holy and to be holy. Because a lot of what we see in the church, a lot of the times, unfortunately, is performance, and he doesn't care for performance. Jesus didn't care for it. That's why he rebuked the Pharisees. You can have a lot of things that you do, spiritual disciplines and performance and the right words that you say, and have all this head knowledge and not know God. Jesus made it very clear when he said, a lot of people will say, Lord, Lord, but he'll say, depart, because I didn't know you. What does that mean? That means your heart could be so far from God and you still could be doing for him. And so I want you to understand that, like, the key to the healing and the redemption and all the things from your trauma is actually knowing him, having your heart towards him, like being like David. That's one of the things lately that has really been anchoring me, like having a heart like David and what that looks like. What does that mean? And that just means being faithful and loving God and his ways and his laws, and just, again, being repentant, right? And so he knows you're going to mess up. He says we're frail, right? We're frail like grass. We wither. And so he understands we're going to mess up. We're going to sin. We're going to do a lot of the things that we don't want to do. Paul tells us that, like, right? Like, I do what I don't want to do and I don't do what I want to do. Like, that's the flesh that we're always going to have. So you're going to stumble. You're going to fall short. The whole point is your heart posture like, if I sin, I don't love it. And if you don't love it, then you're in the right place. That you're fine, that you go to the Father, you repent and ask him to help you and to give you strength again, to not do it, to give you strength to deny the enemy so that he can flee, to give you strength to deny the temptation, to give you the ability and to the transformation in your heart to actually uproot that desire so that you're no longer tempted by the enemy. Like, these are things that we have to understand, is like, that is what we have to do. And just understanding that it is normal. You're going to sin. He doesn't expect us to be sinless. He just expects us to not love the sin and to repent when we do, and not live an unrepentant life and not love the sin and purposely want to sin. And so I just want to, again, share with you the fact that he will meet you where you are. And so don't think that you have to be any kind of thing to meet God. No, God is just waiting on you to just cry out to him, literally, and he will rescue you. And so what he healed versus what he's still healing. So, like I said, I want to normalize the fact that it's an ongoing healing, but you should see fruit from each stage of healing. So you shouldn't be healing in one area for the rest of your life. You should be seeing stages. There should be victories that you've overcome with certain things that you've dealt with or things that you've struggled with, right? And so, but I just want you to know that it is actually ongoing, and it's not because he doesn't have the ability to not make it so. It's just because he wants to build dependence. He wants to build character. He wants us to understand perseverance. All of these things are things he's put in place as to why he does it more slowly versus the fact that it's not that he can't do it. And like I said, there are some things that he might just do instantly because he doesn't want it to be a stumbling block. But a lot of the times he's actually just creating dependence, and that's why he does it slowly and over time. So if you feel too damaged for God, he's not waiting for a better version of you. And like I said, he's waiting for you to just come now. And Jesus gave the parable of the prodigal son, and how after the prodigal son wasted all his money and did all the things, the father was waiting. When he saw him, he just ran after him with joy because he was waiting on him. That is how God is waiting on you. So whether you've known him before or you want to know him, just know that he's waiting on you. And that's the same joy that the father had when he saw his prodigal son return. That is the same joy that God has when he sees you. And so I just want you to know that he's not waiting on you to be a better version of yourself. You become a better version of yourself when he works in you. And so I just want to close with the fact that, if this resonated, understanding that you're not alone. I just want you to know that God already sees you. And so you don't have to, be worrying if he sees or he saw that, or if, he understands, or, even if you're wrestling with being angry with him of why that happened to you or why did he allow a certain thing, just take it to the Lord. Like, he's not intimidated by any of our emotions. He's not intimidated by our raw feelings. He's not. He's God. He's sovereign. So you can take whatever it is that you're feeling to him and just explain it to him and let him heal you and let him truly do that good work in you. And so I want to leave you with a scripture that I pray encourages you, because it has encouraged me many times. And it's Psalms 34:18, and it says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." And so I want you to understand that he is close to you, those who are brokenhearted. And so he doesn't just overlook you like the world does. He doesn't just neglect you like people do. He doesn't think you're a burden like people would. He actually is close to those who are brokenhearted because, again, he understands our frailty. He understands that we are just dust. And so he is close to you, and he does save those who are crushed in spirit. That's why he said, "Those who are heavy laden, come unto me that I might give you rest." So the peace and the joy and the stability and the security that you seek is in Christ alone. And we can go to all the things we try to with crystals and horoscopes and all the things to try to control our day and see what our day is going to look like and see how we can make sure that we feel this way or feel that way. All of that is just control. And I've been there. I've been in horoscopes when I was younger. I've been, haven't done the crystals and all that stuff, but I've experienced it through people, family members. I've experienced people doing witchcraft. I've seen it all. And I understand that everybody's trying to get leverage, get control, get outcomes. But I'm telling you that if you lean on God, you won't need those things. Because those things are actually, one, temporary, but two, it's actually a faux version. And so you might think that you're getting leverage and you might think that you have control, and hence why you have to be constantly indulging in it, right? I just want you to understand that the thing that you truly seek is Christ alone. And like Christ told the woman at the well, the water that you thirst after is actually quenched. Your thirst will be quenched when you actually indulge in the living water, and the living water is Christ. And so I really, really pray that this episode has helped you. I pray that my testimony has helped you. I want to thank you for watching up until this point. I definitely wholeheartedly want you to know, like I said, that God sees and he hears. And he is here as well. He's in your home. He's in your living room, your bathroom, wherever you are. He's with you. He is there. And so, again, if you just want to cry out to him and just want to seek him, you can. The Bible promises that if you seek him, you will find him. And so, unlike the other things you try to seek to cope, I promise you that the moment that you actually go to the Lord, he will heal a lot of the things. And for me personally, he has definitely redeemed me from depression. from anxiety, from a lot of the things that I really struggled with. He's working through with me on self-worth and security and finding rest in him and security in him, and my self-reliance and realizing that I don't have to run this rat race of like thinking I have to constantly create or constantly do to get things done. I don't have to do spiritual disciplines thinking that's going to please God. If I spoke to him throughout the day and that's all I ever did, he would love that because that's relationship. Now, yes, does he want me to read his word and things like that? Yes, because like I said, it helps us to understand who he truly is. It helps us to understand how we should be living as believers. It helps us to understand, just God's power and his sovereignty and just all of the things. So yes, we need that knowledge. And so reading your word is important, but I just want us to start doing from a place of overflow from his love and not doing from a place of wanting his love. And so I want you to understand that you don't have to do to get his love. He already told us that he so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. And so he already loved us, which is why he gave us Christ, right? He wrapped himself down in flesh and died. And so he already loved us. And so you don't have to do things to be loved. I want you to do things from his love, from his salvation, right? And so yeah, like I said, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments if you have any prayer requests. I would definitely love to pray with and for you. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss another episode of What I Am Learning in My 30s. And yeah, I cannot wait until we meet again next time. I love you guys and thank you.